Okay, I think we'll go ahead and start then. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Um, I just want to, I think many of you have heard this already, but just one more reminder that the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a little Q&A button. You can click on that at any point during the presentation today and enter your questions, and we will come to those questions at the end. I'm really glad that you all joined us today, and I'm really thrilled to be able to introduce Adam Landon. Adam is a candidate for the position of Assistant Unit Leader in the USGS Washington Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit and a faculty member in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences at University of Washington. What I would like to do now, before I introduce Adam, is to just recognize that the University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. I'm Sarah Converse, and I'm the unit leader of the USGS Washington Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit and an associate professor in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences and the School of Aquatic and Fisheries Sciences at University of Washington. And again, I'm really pleased to have Adam Landon here today with us. Adam is a research social scientist with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at the University of Minnesota. Adam is a candidate for, as I mentioned, the assistant unit leader position in the Washington Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. Adam's research is on the human dimensions of wildlife management, especially environmental and conservation psychology and the social psychology of leisure. And he's going to be talking to us today about vision for a human dimensions of wildlife research program in Washington. All right, Adam, take it away.
All right, great. Thank you very much for that introduction. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to be here today to continue our dialogue regarding the assistant unit leader position. Welcome to my kitchen. It's a strange place to be for an interview like this, but here we are. So like Dr. Converse said, my name is Adam Landon. My pronouns are he, his, him. Today I'm going to share with you my vision for a human dimensions research program in Washington. I just want to say before we start that this seems like a great opportunity and a great place with a great group of folks, and I wish you the best of luck in finding the right candidate for this position. So before jumping into the material, here's just a brief agenda for my presentation. First, I'll share some very brief information about my current role, work history, educational background, and then sort of taking direction from the selection committee to heart, I'll provide an overview of my current research and recently completed research with an emphasis on its connection to management. To do this, I'll present a short case study related to our efforts in Minnesota to modernize waterfowl hunting regulations and how human dimensions research fits in that process. Next, I'll spell out my approach to partnership with external collaborators and how a human dimensions research program can help inform natural resource management. I'll explain my theoretical interests and provide a second short case study about place attachment and psychological need satisfaction to sort of demonstrate my approach to building theory into applied research. Next, I'll discuss how I think my research interests and program in the human dimensions of wildlife fit with the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. And finally, I'll end with my vision and approach for involving grad students and postdocs in research. So I'm a Western New York native and completed both my bachelor's and master's degrees in my home state before beginning what I call my great migration around the country. My undergraduate degrees from the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, New York, and Wildlife Sciences. After completing my bachelor's degree, I spent several years working as an educator, so both in the classroom and as a naturalist in the field, and completed a master's degree in education from Nazareth College in Rochester. Finally, I attended Texas A&M University for my doctoral degree, where I was a part of several interdisciplinary training programs. I was luckily a recipient of a National Science Foundation Integrative Graduate Education and Research Traineeship in Applied Biodiversity Sciences. So this program focused on biodiversity conservation and sought to provide participants with the skills and knowledge to address real-world conservation challenges, and focused on cross-training students in both the environmental social sciences and ecology and natural sciences. I formally graduated from the Water Management and Hydrological Sciences degree program, as my dissertation work was centered on behavioral change and residential water conservation, all while housed in the Department of Recreation, Park, and Tourism Sciences, where my PhD advisor lived. Most recently, I've spent the last 2.5 years as the Human Dimensions Project lead for the Fish and Wildlife Division, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And prior to my current role, I spent a 1.5 years working with Craig Miller as a postdoc at the Illinois Natural History Survey in the Human Dimensions Research Program there. For the last 1.5 years, I've also held the title of Adjunct Assistant Professor at the University of Minnesota Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, Conservation Biology, where I currently co-advise a PhD student in the Conservation Sciences program, along with David Fulton, who's here today. And I also sit on the graduate faculty in the Conservation Sciences and Natural Resource Science and Management. For the last roughly 6 months, I've also been serving the Academy as an associate editor for the Wildlife Society Bulletin, where I handle manuscripts on the human dimensions of wildlife management. So if you have any HD papers, send them our way. We're happy to give it a fair shake. So the Human Dimensions of Wildlife Research Program in Minnesota is an applied research program and rooted in wildlife governance principles. So as a management agency, Minnesota DNR believes that good decisions about wildlife management issues are made with informed knowledge of how they affect and are affected by various actors and stakeholders. To that end, our research team uses science to better understand the values, beliefs, and attitudes and behaviors of affected stakeholders to inform the agency's role as manager of the public trust. Ultimately, these data that we collect support decision-making processes. And you'll hear me emphasize several times today the critical importance of decision-making in wildlife management. And fundamentally, I believe that generating data in support of decisions is the primary role of human dimensions research. So primarily, our team uses quantitative scientific survey methods to generate estimates of variables of interest to decision makers. So this team is it's a partnership between division leadership at Minnesota DNR, myself as a state agency scientist, and David Fulton and Sue Schrader, who just recently retired at the Minnesota Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. So the studies that I'm going to present today are, for the most part, collaborative efforts of this team of scientists, all working together to serve Minnesota DNR and the people of the state of Minnesota. So while this research collaboration has existed long before my time with the agency, a greater emphasis on human dimensions is expanded in the creation of the position that I currently serve in, beginning in 2018. So since joining Minnesota DNR, I've had the pleasure of working on many research projects. One of the largest is related to white-tailed deer population management. As I'm sure you are all aware, the deer populations generate a suite of costs and benefits that are borne by society, and striking a balance between them is an imperative for management agencies. Every 10 years, as directed by the statewide deer management plan, goals are set for deer populations in deer permit areas around the state. So these goals are referent to the current population and articulated as a desired percent change in the population. For instance, a goal for a deer permit area may be to increase the population by 25% over the next 10 years. The process to arrive at that goal involves input from stakeholders around the state and discussions with foreign sovereign tribal nations that are shared geography. A critical element of this process has been to estimate the preferences of two populations of stakeholders, those of deer hunters and landowners. So in 2019, we began a 4-year study to survey these stakeholder groups and determine their desired direction for change and the magnitude of that desired change with respect to deer population. So either where they live or their property is located or where they hunt. So this is an incredibly fine scale survey effort. In 2019 alone, we generated statistically representative estimates for 82 unique subpopulations from nearly 40,000 randomly selected participants using mail-based methods. So a summary of one of the 4 blocks of permit areas that we surveyed in that year is summarized in the figure here to the right. So ultimately, the information presented here regarding stakeholders' preferences for deer populations will, over the next 10 years, will shape the goal that is set and the management strategy that's used to achieve that goal over time. So there's a direct connection to ultimate management outcomes with this pretty large scale study that we're doing on deer populations. I've also, in addition to deer management, been involved in the state's process to update its wolf management plan. The last time a survey was done of Minnesotans on the topic of wolf management was done by Stephen Kellert back in the 90s. So consequently, updating our understanding of Minnesotans' values for wolves and preferences for wolf management was an important part of the early stages of the wolf plan update process, especially given substantive changes in demography of the state, the institutional context surrounding wolf management, and changing social values for wildlife. So information from this study is informing our internal work on the plan itself and the work of a public advisory committee and a panel of technical experts convened to assist in wolf establishing conservation recommendations. So in partnership with the Minnesota Co-op unit, we surveyed 3 stakeholder groups on issues related to wolf management during the fall of 2019. These groups included livestock producers, deer hunters, and Minnesota residents statewide. Topics included in the study included participants' assigned values for wolves, their attitudes toward wolf management, their support or opposition for establishing a wolf hunting or trapping season, their wildlife value orientations, and issues specific to each of the stakeholder groups, including producers' experiences with wolf depredation, for instance. Well, it's not the only policy question of interest in the plan revision. The decision of whether or not the state will institute a hunting or trapping season for wolves is perhaps the most hotly contested one. As you can see here, looking across stakeholder groups, there are substantively different positions on the issue. Livestock producers and deer hunters are extremely supportive of potential seasons, is owing to perceived negative impacts of wolves on deer populations in the northern part of the state and producers' experiences with loss from depredation. While Minnesota residents are roughly split in support or opposition. Interestingly, our results mirror very closely a recent national study that addressed the acceptability of wolf hunting. We find strong correlation between respondents' wildlife value orientations and their position on this issue. So these data alone do not dictate a decision on the issue, but they're part of a much larger process of engagement and decision making. Our Human Dimensions research team has been intimately involved in investigations related to chronic wasting disease management. So over the last 2 years, we've conducted 3 studies on the topic. And for those of you that are not familiar, CWD is a fatal neurological disease in deer. This is an emerging concern for wildlife managers across North America. So efforts to contain the disease and mitigate its negative effects on deer populations and the humans that derive benefits from them requires aggressive, often controversial changes to deer hunting regulations and management strategy. So these include carcass movement restrictions, mandatory testing of harvested deer, liberalization of antlerless harvest, targeted culling, and many others. These changes for the rules and use of deer harvest have the potential to negatively impact user satisfaction and long-term participation. And moreover, many strategies require voluntary behavioral adoption. So we conducted 2 studies in the Southeast CWD management zone in the state to evaluate hunters and landowners' preferences for management, their perceived risks from the disease, their satisfaction, and patterns of deer hunting behavior. So we were particularly interested in evaluating the potential for the use of financial incentives as a mechanism to enhance deer take with a goal of density reduction and to facilitate access to private lands. So we used a stated choice experiment to assess the influence of various attributes of a potential CWD management program on landowners' choice of alternative programs. So results of this work, which are under review, are presented to the right and show a general rejection of incentives as a tool for CWD management among landowners. And ultimately, these data directed the agency not to adopt the program, looking to change landowner and hunter behavior using market instruments. Since deer parts present a risk for human-mediated transmission of CWD to new areas, we've also been interested in determining how hunters are disposing of their deer carcasses and how they're processing their deer. So this we conducted a survey of deer hunters statewide to try to assess those issues, among other questions related to perceived risks from chronic wasting disease and other management concerns. This is work that we hope to begin publishing soon. Currently, our team's engaged in 4 primary data collection efforts. We're conducting the 3rd round of deer population goal setting. We're conducting a survey of lapsed deer hunters in support of the department's efforts to recruit, retain, and reactivate hunters. The study is looking at hunters' motivations, their hunting activity, constraints they might face in hunting participation, and their satisfaction with the activity itself. We're also partnering with scientists and tribal resource managers from many disciplines and jurisdictions in an effort to support a community-based participatory research project on tribal deer management. Our team's working with band members in Anishinaabe communities in the upper Midwest to understand the values that Indigenous people hold for deer and deer hunting and the risks that they perceive CWD to pose to traditional lifestyles, and working to improve efforts on outreach about CWD to these communities. Finally, we're currently collecting data to support an effort to update waterfowl regulations in Minnesota, and I'll expand on this study in a section to follow here. So Minnesota has very conservative waterfowl hunting regulations, and this stems from a social ecological context that no longer exists. At one time, demand for waterfowl hunting activity was much higher than it is today, and waterfowl populations were much lower. Since 1998, the state has shed around 100,000 small game hunters, inclusive of all activities. So this has set up a situation where there are nearly half as many hunters as there were, and higher waterfowl populations than there were in the past, which begs the question of the utility of these existing regulatory structures, especially in the face of normative commitments from the agency to make hunting accessible to all people and to maximize opportunity. So several potential changes to the regulatory structure have been put forward by managers and stakeholders that warrant further investigation, including establishing an early teal season, allowing for increased blue-winged teal harvest during the regular duck season, eliminating a rule that closes shooting at 4 p.m. during the early part of the season, eliminating a rule which prohibits hunting over open water, and allowing the use of motorized decoys during the entirety of the regular season, and increasing the dark goose bag limit. So a major concern is that the waterfowl hunters that remain in Minnesota are incredibly highly involved in the activity. So this sets up the possibility for backlash if proposed changes are incongruent with their mental models and preferred modes of experience of these users. So before a decision can be made on this issue, there's a need to evaluate participants' preferences for these various proposals. So to do this, we designed a survey of Minnesota waterfowl stamp purchasers. We randomly selected stamp purchasers according to their place of residence within 3 waterfowl hunting zones in the state and the Twin Cities metro region in order to ensure statewide coverage of hunters. Results are then weighted to account for the distribution of these individuals in regions and by age categories. So data collection followed a mixed mode design in three waves. So in the first 2 rounds, we sent letters to participants in the mail, asking them to go to a website and complete a questionnaire. Then in the 3rd round, which is about to commence, non-respondents will receive a paper copy of the questionnaire with a reply envelope. So the study also included a choice experiment to assess preference for regulations, although I won't be discussing that here. So at the end of 2 rounds of survey, we have nearly 1,000 responses and are on track for our targeted response rate. So preliminary results show a range of support and opposition for regulatory proposals. So as you can see here to the right, the proposal to adopt a higher teal bag limit during the regular season was met with strong support among waterfowl hunters in the preliminary data. However, the proposal to establish an early teal season saw much greater heterogeneity, is shown by the percent of respondents falling within each of these categories on their response to questions about their support or opposition to each of these proposals. So ultimately, a decision has to be made regarding these regulatory issues. This is a stylized depiction of the process that rule will go through and where human dimensions research fits in this process. So a proposed issue is subject to scientific investigation regarding its potential ecological consequences and the potential effects to stakeholders. So my main role at DNR is in the generation of social data that feeds into this process. So exactly in the manner that we described regarding the waterfowl management issue. So once data are collected, a suite of alternatives are developed and evaluated against objectives in light of the mission of the agency, values, normative commitments, and a proposal makes its way through the decision-making chain, ultimately resulting in a final adoption. So in making the decision with respect to the waterfowl issue, there are a few options are apparent, each with consequences for different objectives. We have an idea what these objectives are, but since this is an ongoing issue, I don't want to show them here. So just as a hypothetical consequence table might look something like this, where a status quo option, a win-win option, and a liberal option are evaluated against objectives. Often these objectives are articulated in species planning documents, for instance, maximizing waterfowl hunting opportunity or minimizing conflict. So looking to the social data on this topic, a win-win change might be the adoption of a higher teal bag limit, as shown by the data in the previous slide, two slides previous, while establishing an early teal season may be a more liberal option, given potential for conflict. So importantly, qualitative judgments that support decision-making are supported by the quantitative results of scientific investigations of stakeholder preferences, among other important pieces of information. So I wanted to use this waterfowl case study for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's a good example of how human dimensions research can directly inform management, my experience in doing that management-focused research. And two, it was a collaboration with the Minnesota Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, and an example of the sort of capacity that I can bring to this position. So, my focus, if selected for this role, and my vision for collaboration would be on producing data that helps leaders make decisions, much like in the studies that I've shared here today. So decisions on wildlife management are also often about setting new policy, about merging concerns like CWD, changing policy about issues that people are deeply invested in, like waterfowl hunting, and planning for evolving social, ecological, economic conditions, kind of like wolf management. So in sum, I'd work to support the decision-making process through applied social science. I think, in that vision, you don't need not look further than the mission of the co-op units itself. So to meet the actionable science needs of cooperators and to develop the future workforce through graduate education. Well, I'll have more to say on the second point in a moment. My commitments on research stem from this vision and the needs of cooperators, and I've had the unique opportunity to serve on the cooperator side of this relationship for the last 2.5 years, and I'll draw on my experience in Minnesota as an example. So applied research is important, but theory is the bedrock of the social sciences, and theoretical advancement is important and frankly interesting. So it is difficult, but not impossible to advance theory while doing applied science. And there are lots of opportunities in the wildlife management context to do that. I particularly like the quote here from a recent article regarding that doing high impact social psychology, where the author says that there's much inspiration for theory to be found in societal problems. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. At the broadest level of categorization, I'm a social psychologist, and my my interests are specifically in environmental and conservation psychology and the social psychology of leisure. So I'm particularly interested in humans' connection to nature and the influence of nature on human well-being, place and community attachment, environmental values and identity, and behavior change and pro-environmental behavior. So I've conducted studies on each of these issues and often in concert with applied data collection efforts in support of natural resource management. So I also have an interest in the literature on the social psychology of leisure, and this literature permeates research on outdoor recreation. So leisure and recreation are essentially synonyms. So especially leisure preferences, folks' motivation for engaging in different recreation activities, the constraints they face and how they overcome those constraints, and their ego involvement and commitment to recreation activities and settings. So just as an example of some of my scholarship, so I was a contributor to 3 original manuscripts recently published in a special issue on conservation psychology and conservation biology. These are to the right here on the screen. These works included an empirical test and extension of the values basis of pro-environmental behavior, a review paper on the state of the literature in conservation psychology, and a primer on the measurement of psychological variables. So I view human dimensions as a community of practice rather than a specific field in and of itself. So in my practice, I seek to apply these buckets of theory to management issues using a variety of tools. And this is just an example of some of the tools here. So switching gears a little bit, I want to provide another short case study. So moving beyond explicitly management-focused research, I wanted to discuss something a little bit more theoretically oriented in a study that I was involved in. So my intent here is to demonstrate my interests and also my approach to science and how I use applied studies when appropriate to generate theoretical advancements. So place attachment is defined as the cognitive and affective bonds between an individual or group in their social and physical context. So it's a core concept in the social sciences and an idea that permeates a lot of human thought and behavior. So it's important because one's attachment to their environment is thought to lead to specific well-being outcomes and have motivational properties, like a propensity to undertake place protective behaviors. So as you can surmise, that's a critical part of nature conservation and in understanding different stakeholders' reactance to social, ecological, institutional change. In the recreation literature, authors have put forward a hypothesis that place attachment comes from the ability of a space or a landscape to provide for preferred modes of recreation. So examples of studies that have adopted this lens are here to the right, one of which I happen to be a part of. Yet, humans' affinity for natural landscapes is far deeper than their recreation experience. It's evolutionary derived, and that much more complex than the satisfactions that they may achieve in location. So this, my co-authors and I suggested, was reflected in the sort of tenuous evidence that exists to support the theory underlying the explanation put forward in the literature to date. And we thought that there could be more fundamental psychological processes at play that lead to the formation of attachment to natural settings that are the context of nature-based recreation. So specifically, we thought that self-determination theory and the sub-theory of psychological need satisfaction, intrinsic motivation, provided a plausible alternative as to why people may become attached to nature settings. So this theory hypothesizes that a state of intrinsic motivation arises from contexts where humans' needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness are fulfilled. And we suggested that nature settings afford opportunities for the realization of these needs for some people. So to the extent that natural landscapes afford for opportunities to satisfy basic psychological needs, humans may experience intrinsic motivation, optimal psychological functioning, and therefore develop bonds with those settings in the form of place attachment. So we were provided with a great opportunity to test this hypothesis when we were approached by the Wilderness Society conducted a survey of visitors to wilderness areas to two national forests in the southeastern U.S. in anticipation of forest management plans for these properties. They're seeking to understand just uses and users of these spaces. So to rehash, we had a hypothesis that visitors to wilderness areas are perceived that a place of importance provided for opportunities for the satisfaction of psychological needs would also hold feelings of identification, dependence, and affect toward that place or attachment. So that hypothesis is depicted here graphically, including the hypothesis measurement of these constructs. So to test this hypothesis, we used a structural equation modeling approach. In this method, the plausibility of a generalized hypothesis depicting the causal relationships between sets of measures is tested using a comparison of model and a population covariance matrix. So if the model is shown to fit the data, is because the hypothesized set of relationships conforms to the data itself, as revealed by the congruence of these matrices. So glossing over some the data collection procedure and the measurement of these variables, we found support for our hypotheses, especially that psychological needs satisfaction is positively associated with place attachment. So this is evidenced by the model fit above and the structural relationships shown in the table here. And we were successful in publishing this work in Environment and Behavior just this past year. So we felt this is an interesting paper and one that serves as a foundation for future investigations regarding relationships between psychological need satisfaction and the experience of one's social and physical context, and has potential for much broader implications. We hope that others will run with it in experimental context. So we've also brought elements of the theory that we drew on here into other studies, including our current investigation of lapsed deer hunters. So in sum, I feel this is a decent theoretical contribution, and it stems from an applied data need and gives an example of some of my broader interests. So I believe that my interests, experience, and skills are a great fit for this program. Fundamentally, I think I add expertise in human dimensions of wildlife management. Washington's a world-class institution with renowned social scientists in the theories and methods that I apply in my work. I can bring contextual knowledge of the norms of practice in the human dimensions of wildlife, and I believe that this knowledge and experience would be a benefit to both the students and faculty in the school. Clearly, that includes wildlife focus, but other natural resource contexts as well. I think there's increasing interest in HD among graduate training programs, and that is likely, a reason for this position. I like to think that I'm doing quality work in this area, and that I'm poised to do my best work in the future, and I'd love to do it here in Washington. I also bring experience and expertise in interdisciplinary conservation science. I have formal training in bridging social science and ecology and natural science through both my time at A&M and in my research experience. So I think I also could fill an important role in graduate student committees, especially where students are hoping to do interdisciplinary research that might include a social science component. I have expertise in quantitative survey methods and analyses of psychological data, especially structural equation modeling, quasi-experimental designs. I'm excited about the prospect of offering a grad level course on conservation social science and see this as a clear contribution to the school. And finally, recognizing that this position is a full appointment in CEFS, I'm saying it right. I have a interest and experience in water resources and in recreational fisheries and aquatic conservation issues, and would hope to be able to partner with colleagues across the schools. Circling back to that mission of the co-op units, students are just a critical part. They're also the backbone of university research, and would be central in the program that I would build. Both in terms of being designed to educate students about human dimensions issues and methods, but also as partners in conducting the work itself. I think applied studies are really good for master's theses in a lot of ways. The timelines are typically add up. Financial investment necessary is aligned with the data need, especially if it's funded by an agency partner. And the scope of the projects are aligned with expectations of quality and quantity for master's degree. So obviously, postdocs and PhD students require different commitment. And there are different expectations for the quality of work that they do. Data have a need to have theoretical insights and warrant granting of a PhD, but I think there's synergies between applied studies and other forms of collection that could facilitate that kind of work. For instance, experiments that can lay theoretical foundations for testing ideas in the field, and applied studies offer an opportunity to do that. I think that there's co-op unit science is especially poised to pursue like AFWA and WAFWA multi-state grants, and that postdocs and PhD students are a good fit for those opportunities. Okay, as I'm running out of time here, I'll do a quick summary. My focus is on applied research. I would look to develop a research program and capacity to support collaborators' needs for data to make decisions. In doing that, I would look to build in questions related to environmental conservation psychology and social psychology of leisure. I'm an interdisciplinary scientist, and I bring an expertise in the human dimensions of wildlife. And I would have a commitment to fund and support grad students in HD research, because they're needed for grad students. Grad students are needed in the conduct of research. So thank you for the opportunity to apply. I'd say feel free to reach out to me on any topic. I'm always happy to meet new folks, start collaborations, and share anything, surveys, questionnaires, whatever I can to help support you in your work. So I guess with that, let's start opening up for questions.
Thank you so much, Adam. Obviously, one of the things about doing it this way is that you can't hear us all applauding, but that was great. Thank you so much. So yeah, again, everyone, please do go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A down at the bottom of your screen, and I will read those out for Adam. So the first question we have comes from John Marsliff. And the question is, have you been involved in issues in which ecological science and social science produce different recommendations for decision makers? And if so, how have those discrepancies been worked out?
Ooh, I think we're probably involved in one at the moment, but it's more of a normative question related to wolf management. I think from a scientific standpoint, the question of, what can the wolf population in Minnesota sustain harvest is, the answer is yes. But I think the data will lead our, at least current administration politically, to think that it's probably not one that is aligned with the values of the people of the state. I suspect that it will lead to a larger conflict that's potentially remedied in the legislature. So maybe it's not a good example, given that it's the decision-making process is one that's occurring at a much larger political scale than sort of our sphere of influence. I'm trying to think of another. We typically are, let's say, the agencies that I've been involved in, I guess, haven't really faced an issue where that's occurred, where well, I'll back up. I think we do have instances where our deer hunting public wants substantial increases in the population. Yet those are in conflict with other stakeholders. And our approach has been in one of weighing what potential outcomes of those decisions are, and seeking to minimize the potential negative effect on folks. So one's interest in having more deer to hunt is not necessarily outweighed by substantial, for instance, damage that might occur to landowners for that alternative, objective. So, not sure if I answered that entirely right, but a couple examples at least of conflicting values.
Yeah, yes, that's great. Thank you. Okay, so Beth Gardner has a question, and others feel free to go ahead and add questions into the Q&A link. So Beth says, thanks. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the specific statistical approaches you use in your research and what software programs you use.
Yeah, I'd say at least from a survey perspective, the statistics begin with our design. So estimating the size of samples that we need to pull from finite populations, very similar to what you might do in ecology. I tend to do, like I said, a lot of psychology work, and a lot of that is related to variables that you can't measure directly, so those latent variables, and structural equation modeling techniques are, kind of been my go-to there. But lots of regression models for limited dependent variables, so logistic regression, things of that nature are pretty common in my work. Choice experiments have become a much more prominent focus, and one that I hope to continue. And software packages, I use Stata mostly, which is kind of the standard in a lot of the social sciences, or especially in economics, but increasingly R as well, moving most all of my structural equation modeling work into R, because and for a number of reasons, but yeah, Stata is my go-to at least.
Great, thank you. Okay, so a question from Sergey Rabakyukov. Sergey says, great talk. And where do you see your field advancing in the next decade?
Yeah, I think that sort of the human dimensions sphere, especially in the wildlife arena, is at a point of maturation right now. I think it's moving away from these sort of state level studies focused on hunters specifically. And I see the field moving much more towards general public, resident populations of study, and also much larger geographic scales, so regional assessments for the purposes of both, equity and diversity and inclusion, moving beyond hunters and anglers, which have been the focus of human dimensions work historically, to populations that might have non-consumptive interests in fish and wildlife management. I think that's kind of two issues that are occurring that are, I think, related to one another.
Okay, great, thanks. And Jerry Nelson has a question. Can you tell us a little bit more about your collaborations with tribes?
Yeah, that the study that I mentioned there has been kind of for sure the largest collaboration that I've had with tribal folks, and I'm sort of just a advisory member to that project. My interaction with tribes has been as one of as a scientist at least, just consult and advise sort of role, more than one that was engaged in higher level political formal consultation and things of that nature. But our agency, and I think in particular the conservation sciences program and at University of Minnesota, is becoming really interested in tribal management and helping facilitate tribes in making their own decisions. And it's kind of just at the forefront right now, and it's been pretty exciting though to do that, to be a part of that, and pretty fulfilling, I think, too.
Great, thank you. Stacy Ambergy has a question. You talked about wanting to continue advancing and developing the HD sort of philosophy and applications. What are the unique opportunities or systems that you see in Washington tribal agency university collaborators that provide to do that work?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I think one of the really interesting things about Washington is just the sheer diversity of topics that exist. There's from species that I've never even seen, like to I think that it's also a unique state demographically, a lot of diversity in terms of human subjects to study, but also that kind of heterogeneity it institutes some complexities too that are interesting challenges. I think I think Washington's a fascinating state to consider doing this type of work in.
Great, thanks. probably some similarities with Minnesota and having a very large urban center, but
Yeah.
also a lot of very rural areas. Yeah. Um, okay, Ken Warhite has a question about the duck example. It
Yep.
says your flow chart included a social science box and a tribal consultation box. So how do you incorporate those Indigenous people's values in the work?
Yeah, it for us has been historically a struggle. I think past administrations have not done it at all, and we're currently working to set up the kinds of relationships that are necessary to do that. The survey projects that I've been involved in the time that I've been at Minnesota DNR, at least, have not involved assessments of tribal and band members specifically, although we've tried to. We've just struggled to, and on the time frames I think that we've been operating on, particularly with the Wolf Plan, and I think speaking to maybe the critical importance of that issue. It was difficult for us to land at a place where we do that. I put that consultation box in there just for it to be upfront that occurs, and it occurs, I think, a little bit separately, at least in the way that we're assessing and collecting social data.
Okay, great. I actually wanted to follow up on that because something else I noticed in that flow chart that made me wonder is that the scientific assessment flowed into development of alternatives, and typical models of sort of decision analysis emphasize the establishment of alternatives ahead of the scientific assessment because it can guide the scientific assessment, right? What are we asking questions about? Should to a degree be shaped by what we might do. So I just wondered what your thoughts were about that.
I'll be upfront that I made that flow chart. That is not one that is this a formally adopted by the agency, but that's a great point. I think that's a really important point because it could shape even what you would begin to collect data on, what your existing knowledge of the literature is, or your existing, what studies you've conducted preliminarily. So yeah, I totally agree with you, and I'm sure that would be, worthy of revision, or at least some reciprocal arrows or something in the flow chart.
Okay, great, thanks. Great question from Bernard Borman. Bernard, you and I should talk about this sometime too when we get a chance. So the question is, where do you stand on wildlife policy experiments following the science-based adaptive management ideas espoused by former co-op director Ken Williams, and I should probably say lots of other people as well?
By policy experiment, what do you mean specifically?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and let, if he's there, Bernard say this in his own words. So let me see, allowed to talk. Bernard, you should be able to ask your question aloud.
Great, yeah, thanks. So policy experiments in the adaptive management world, it could include things like, and it's been done in Idaho with hunting regulations, where different parts of the state had different regulations, and those were then studied. Ken Williams and his group worked on waterfowl hunting regulations, where they annually adjusted harvest quotas based on data and how it was interacting with various models. Just using science more in the policy arena, directly rather than indirectly.
Yeah, that's I think that's awesome. I would be fully supportive of doing work like that, and I think that increasingly, as the public demands transparency in how decisions are made, that frameworks, adaptive management frameworks that have articulated trigger points for how decisions are made are going to be more and more important. And science, experiments like this or like those that you've described are a great way to demonstrate how, for instance, impacts from decisions you could evaluate impacts from decisions and then feed back into, for instance, that scientific assessment and alternatives that might exist. So yeah, I think that it's a really great, frontier and topic of research.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
We have time for another question. If anyone has another one, I'll just give you a minute to put that into the chat, see if anyone has anything else. Yes, okay, great. Lisanne Petraka asks, have you employed any spatial components to your work, such as determining how attitudes or preferences vary across space?
Yes, I've worked with, I use GIS at least on the front end, and a fair number of my studies for planning purposes and sampling and things like that. I would say one study that was a partner with a graduate student when I was at Illinois, where we looked at kind of spatial correlations of patterns of angling license sales. I think that the area of understanding the preferences of stakeholders in space is an important one and probably an emerging one. It's one that I'd be comfortable moving into, but it's not one that I've explicitly dealt with from the onset of a study, for instance. So.
Great, thank you. All right, I think then we will go ahead and end it there. Just want to thank you again, Adam, and again, hopefully you can hear the virtual applause. Thanks so much for taking time to chat with us today. We really appreciate it. And obviously many of us will continue to be having conversations with you over the next couple of weeks. So thanks very much. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Really appreciate it. And we'll sign off now. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Al.